Wait outside. This is a closed room. The words didn't echo, they landed, heavy and deliberate, like a door being shut in someone's face before they even reached the handle. The private dining room on the 42nd floor of the Sterling Grand overlooked the Manhattan skyline, glass walls stretching from floor to ceiling, the late afternoon sun casting gold across a table set for power, crystal glasses, tailored place settings, contracts stacked neatly beside plates no one had touched yet. 12 seats. 11 already filled. And one man standing just inside the doorway, still holding the silence like it belonged to him. Ethan Cole didn't move. Not immediately. He stood there in a charcoal suit that didn't beg for attention, no watch flashing under the light, no entourage announcing his presence, just a quiet stillness that felt out of place in a room built on noise, money, and assumption. Across the table, Richard Halstead, the head of the billionaire family hosting the deal, didn't even bother looking up fully. His fingers tapped once against the rim of his glass, impatient. Staff usually waits in the hall, he added, almost casually, like correcting a minor inconvenience. A faint chuckle slipped from someone to his left. Another voice followed, softer but sharper. Guess they're letting anyone walk in now. The air shifted, not louder, just tighter. Ethan stepped forward anyway. One step. Then another. Measured. Controlled. Like he had already accepted the outcome and was simply walking toward it. No apology. No explanation. He reached the table and took the only empty seat without asking. That was the first disruption. Subtle. But enough. A pause rippled through the room, quick glances exchanged like quiet currency. A woman in a tailored navy dress raised an eyebrow. A younger man near the end of the table leaned back, studying Ethan like he was trying to place a face he couldn't quite remember. Richard finally looked up, eyes narrowing just enough to register irritation. I think there's been a misunderstanding, he said, his tone polished but edged. This meeting is for principals only. Ethan rested his hands lightly on the table, fingers brushing the edge of a thick folder placed in front of him. He didn't open it. Didn't even glance at it. Instead, he looked straight ahead, not at Richard, not at anyone in particular, just forward, as if the room itself wasn't finished revealing something yet. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, he said, calm, even, his voice cutting clean through the low hum of disbelief. Another chuckle. Louder this time. You hear that? Someone muttered. Confidence. Gotta respect it. A glass was lifted. Someone else poured wine, but not for Ethan. Not even by accident. The omission hung there, small but deliberate. Across the room, a waiter hesitated near the wall, tray in hand, eyes flicking between faces, sensing something wasn't right but not yet knowing why. Ethan noticed everything. The way documents were angled away from him. The way conversations curved around his presence like he was furniture. The way no one asked his name, because they had already decided it didn't matter. And still, he said nothing more. Because sometimes silence wasn't absence. Sometimes it was pressure, building, waiting for the exact moment to break everything open. And in that room, under the quiet glow of Manhattan's skyline, that moment was already closer than anyone at that table could see. Richard Halstead leaned back slowly, the leather chair creaking just enough to punctuate the shift in his posture, his gaze now fixed on Ethan with a level of attention that had not been there before, not curiosity, not respect, but something closer to controlled irritation, the kind reserved for disruptions that were not supposed to happen at this level. You are either very confident, he said, lifting his glass but still not drinking, or very lost, and a faint smiles around the table. Returned, sharper now, more deliberate, as if the room had collectively agreed on the role Ethan was supposed to play, a mistake, an interruption, something to be corrected and moved past. The woman in navy beside him flipped open her folder and slid a set of documents slightly away from Ethan's reach, not enough to be obvious, just enough to be intentional, while the younger man at the end of the table leaned forward, elbows resting on polished wood, eyes scanning Ethan again, searching for a signal, a badge, a title, anything that would justify his presence, but finding none. "Do you even know what this meeting is about?" he asked, not aggressively, but with the quiet condescension of someone who already believed he knew the answer. Ethan's expression did not change. He did not rush to fill the silence, did not offer credentials, did not reach for the documents that had been subtly denied to him. Instead he let the question sit there, unanswered, stretching the moment until it became uncomfortable, until someone else felt the need to step in, and they did. Another voice from across the table, older, colder. $700 million, the man said, tapping the stack of contracts with 2 fingers. "That is what is on this table today, real money, real stakes, not something you just walk into." A pause followed, then a quieter addition, almost under his breath, but still loud enough to carry. "Not dressed like that." A few nods, a few murmurs of agreement, and again the wine was poured, glasses filled in a slow circle around the table, stopping just short of Ethan, as if he were not part of the sequence, as if his presence had not been approved by whatever invisible system governed this room. Near the wall the waiter shifted his weight, uncertain, glancing once toward Ethan before quickly looking away, choosing silence over risk. While near the corner, a junior associate, barely older than 25, hesitated with a tablet in hand, her eyes lingering on Ethan just a second too long, something in his stillness catching her attention, something that did not align with the narrative unfolding around him. But she said nothing. Not yet. Richard set his glass down untouched, the soft click against the table drawing the room back to him. "We are about to finalize a deal that has taken months of negotiation, multiple firms, multiple boards, and a level of access that is not exactly public," he said, his tone now firm, final. "So I will ask you one more time, who exactly are you here with?" The question landed heavier this time, no longer rhetorical, no longer casual, the room waiting, watching, expecting Ethan to correct himself, to stand, to apologize, to exit quietly and restore the order that had been disturbed. But Ethan did not move. Not a single inch. His hands remained resting on the table, steady, grounded, like anchors in a room that was slowly beginning to tilt. And when he finally spoke, his voice was not louder, not sharper, just precise. "I am here for the deal," he said, and for the first time, the silence that followed was not dismissive, it was uncertain, brief, but enough for the junior associate in the corner to glance down at her tablet again, enough for the waiter to hesitate 1 second longer before stepping back, enough for something invisible in the room to begin shifting, slowly, quietly, like the first crack in something that had always assumed it could not break. The words did not impress them, they irritated them, and irritation at that level never stayed quiet for long. It evolved into something sharper, more deliberate. Richard Halstead leaned forward this time, elbows resting on the table, fingers interlocked as if he were preparing to close something, not a deal, but a conversation. "You are here for the deal," he repeated slowly, tasting the sentence like it did not belong in the room, like it needed to be corrected. "That is not how this works." And with that, the temperature shifted again, colder now, less amused, more controlled. The younger man at the end of the table let out a short breath, not quite a laugh, more like disbelief. "No, what you are here for," he said, tilting his head slightly, "is to take notes, or deliver a message, or wait until someone important shows up." A few nods followed, subtle but aligned. The woman in navy did not look up from her documents, but her voice cut in clean and precise. "We have a timeline today, and we are already behind, so unless your firm sent you with authorization credentials, I suggest you step out and coordinate from the hallway." The sentence was polite, but the meaning was not. It was a dismissal wrapped in professionalism, the kind that allowed them to maintain composure while pushing someone out of the room without raising their voices. Ethan remained still, his gaze steady, not challenging, not submissive, just present in a way that made ignoring him increasingly difficult. The junior associate in the corner shifted again, her eyes now fixed on her tablet, scrolling quickly, searching, her brow tightening slightly as if something was not aligning with what she expected to see, but she stayed silent, still choosing observation over interruption. Across the table one of the older men leaned back in his chair and spoke with a tone that carried quiet authority. "Let me make this simple," he said, tapping the edge of the contract stack again. "This deal involves multiple equity partners, private capital, and a lead investor who has not yet arrived, so if you are not with him, you are in the wrong seat." The statement hung there, reinforced by the weight of everyone else's agreement, and for a moment, it seemed like the room had re-established its order, like the disruption was about to resolve itself the way they expected, through quiet compliance, through Ethan standing up and removing himself from the equation, restoring the balance they were comfortable with. But Ethan did not move. Instead, he reached forward slowly, not toward the wine glass that had never been offered to him, not toward the contracts they had kept just out of his reach, but toward the center of the table where a single pen rested beside the documents. His fingers brushed it lightly, not picking it up, just acknowledging its presence, and that small movement drew every eye back to him again. "You are waiting on the lead investor," he said, his voice still even, still measured. "You have been waiting for 23 minutes, a brief pause, then he added, "Traffic on Park Avenue is heavier than expected this afternoon." The room went still, not because of what he said, but because of how he said it, calm, informed, precise. The younger man frowned slightly. "How would you know that?" he asked, but Ethan did not answer directly. Instead, he let the question linger. The junior associate's eyes widened just slightly as she looked back down at her tablet, her fingers stopping mid-scroll, something clicking into place, something she was not yet ready to say out loud. Richard's expression hardened, not anger, not yet, but something closer to resistance, the kind that appears when control begins to slip in ways that are not immediately visible. "Enough," he said, his voice firmer now. "We are not going to play guessing games. If you are not authorized to be here, you need to leave." And for the first time, the word leave did not sound like a suggestion, it sounded like a boundary, one they fully expected Ethan to respect, one they believed he had no power to challenge. But Ethan did not react to the command, he did not even acknowledge it. Instead, his eyes moved briefly toward the junior associate in the corner, just for a second, long enough for her to freeze, long enough for her to realize that whatever she had just found on her screen was not a coincidence. And in that silent exchange, something shifted again, quieter this time, deeper, like a foundation beginning to crack beneath a surface that still looked perfectly intact. The silence did not break all at once, it stretched, thin and tense, like something being pulled just before it snapped, and in that stretch, the smallest movements became louder than words. The junior associate in the corner shifted her stance again, this time not out of uncertainty but urgency, her eyes locked on the tablet in her hands, the glow of the screen reflecting something new across her face, not confusion anymore, but recognition, and with it came hesitation, the kind that sits in the chest when speaking could change everything in the room. Richard noticed it too, not what she saw, but the change in her posture, the way her attention had moved away from him and towards something else, something he did not control. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice sharp enough to pull focus back to the center. The associate looked up, just for a second, her lips parting like she was about to speak, but then she stopped, the weight of the room pressing down on her decision, the hierarchy clear, the risk real, and she lowered her gaze again, choosing silence, for now. "Then let us stay focused," Richard continued, dismissing the moment as if it had not mattered, as if nothing had shifted, but something had, and it was not going back. Ethan watched it all without turning his head, without drawing attention to the fracture forming just a few feet away. He did not need to, the room was already beginning to feel it, subtle but undeniable, like a current running beneath the surface. The woman in navy closed her folder with a soft but deliberate motion. "We are done entertaining this," she said, her tone now stripped of politeness. "If you do not have the authority to sign, you do not belong at this table." The statement was clear, final, meant to close the situation, and yet, no one moved to enforce it, no one stood, no one called for assistance. Because something about Ethan's stillness made escalation feel uncertain, like stepping forward without knowing what was beneath the ground. The younger man at the end of the table tried to reassert control, leaning forward again, this time more forceful. "Look, man. This is not personal," he said, "though it already was. You might think you are helping your firm by sitting in here, but you are out of your depth. This deal is structured, layered, and very specific, so do yourself a favor and step out before this gets uncomfortable." The irony of the word uncomfortable lingered, because the room was already there, already sitting in a tension none of them had planned for. Ethan's fingers tapped once, lightly, against the table, not a sign of impatience, but rhythm, like he was measuring something only he could see. Then he spoke again, just enough to cut through the overlapping control they were trying to rebuild. "You structured the deal in 3 tiers," he said, calm, precise, equity distribution tied to performance benchmarks over 18 months, with an exit clause triggered by underperformance at the 12-month mark. The words landed differently this time, not dismissed, not laughed off, but absorbed, processed. The younger man blinked. His confidence faltering for just a fraction of a second. That information is not public, he said, more to himself than anyone else. The woman in navy straightened slightly, her eyes narrowing, recalculating. Richard did not speak, but his expression shifted, not outwardly, not dramatically, just enough to show that something no longer aligned with his expectations. Across the room the waiter stepped back another inch, instinctively creating distance from a moment he could not fully understand, and in the corner, the junior associate finally lifted her head again, this time her voice almost breaking through. Sir, I think, she started, but stopped when Richard raised his hand without even looking at her, a silent command to stay quiet, to stay in place, to let him control the narrative, and for a second, she obeyed, but the hesitation did not disappear, it grew. Because now she knew something the rest of the room did not, something that no longer fit the story they were telling themselves about the man sitting calmly at the center of their doubt. Ethan did not push, did not expose, did not correct them, he simply let the truth sit there, unspoken but present, because the moment was not ready yet, not fully, but it was close, closer than any of them realized, and in that room high above Manhattan, the deal they believed was already theirs had begun to slip, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like control leaving a space that had never imagined losing it. The air did not recover from what he said, it tightened further, like every word he placed on the table had weight behind it, real weight, the kind that did not belong to guesses or assumptions, and for the first time since he sat down, no one rushed to respond. The younger man's confidence did not disappear, but it cracked, subtle, almost invisible, his fingers tapping once against the table before he pulled his hand back as if even that motion suddenly felt exposed. You read the summary, he said finally, trying to reframe it, trying to shrink what Ethan had just done into something explainable, something less threatening. Anyone with access to the briefing packet could know that, but even as he said it, his voice lacked the certainty it carried before, because everyone in the room knew that was not entirely true, not the way Ethan had said it, not with that level of precision. The woman in navy did not speak this time, but her posture changed, shoulders pulling back slightly. Eyes no longer dismissive but calculating. She looked at the documents in front of her, then at Ethan, then back again, like she was trying to reconcile two versions of reality that no longer matched. Richard Halstead remained still, but his silence was no longer controlled dominance, it was evaluation, the kind that happens when a situation begins to move outside of expectation, and control has to be remeasured, recalculated. Across the room the junior associate could not hold it anymore, her voice came out quieter than she intended, but it carried. Sir, the access level on this file, she started, her words catching just slightly as every head turned toward her, the sudden attention freezing her for half a second, but this time she did not fully retreat. She glanced down at her tablet again, then back up. It is restricted, she finished, the word landing softly but cutting deeper than anything said before. Restricted meant something, it meant boundaries, it meant permission, it meant that what Ethan had just described was not something someone outside the inner circle should know. A silence followed, heavier now, more dangerous, because it was no longer built on dismissal, it was built on doubt. Richard turned his head slowly toward her, his expression controlled but his eyes sharp. And how exactly would you know that? He asked, not loudly, but with a pressure that made the question feel like a warning. The associate swallowed, her grip tightening slightly on the tablet. Because I have the access logs open, she said, and this time her voice did not falter, and the only active viewer on the primary file is. She stopped, just for a second, as if saying the name out loud would cross a line she could not uncross. The room leaned into that pause without realizing it, every second stretching longer than it should. Ethan did not look at her, did not help her, did not interrupt, he let the moment belong to her. Because truth carried more weight when it came from someone else, especially someone they had already accepted as part of their system, part of their structure. Finish the sentence, Richard said, his tone tightening, the control slipping just enough to be heard. The associate looked up, her eyes no longer uncertain, just resolved. Ethan Cole, she said, and the name did not explode, it did not echo, it simply settled into the room, quiet and irreversible. the kind of truth that does not need volume to change everything. The younger man's expression shifted immediately, confusion flashing across his face as he looked from the associate to Ethan, then back again, trying to process what that meant. The woman in navy stopped flipping through her documents entirely, her hand resting still on the page. Richard did not react outwardly, but something in his posture changed, a stiffness, a recalibration, because the room had just crossed a line, not visibly, not dramatically, but fundamentally, and in that moment, the version of Ethan they had constructed in their minds began to fall apart, piece by piece, replaced by something they had not prepared for, something they did not yet fully understand, and Ethan, still seated, still composed, finally lifted his hand from the table, just slightly, enough to reach for the pen they had ignored before, and this time, he picked it up, not to sign, not yet, but to hold it, as if reminding everyone in the room that control was never about who spoke the loudest, it was about who could end the conversation when it mattered most. The name did not need to be repeated, it did not need to be explained, it simply existed now in the room, and that alone was enough to shift everything, not loudly, not all at once, but in a kind of way that rewrites the atmosphere without asking permission. The younger man leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence dissolving into something less defined, his eyes no longer scanning Ethan as an outsider but trying to reconcile him as something else entirely, something that should have been recognized sooner. That is not possible, he said under his breath, not as a challenge, but as a reflex, the kind people use when reality moves faster than their assumptions. The woman in navy finally spoke again, but this time her voice had lost its edge, replaced by caution. Access logs can be misleading, she said, though even she did not fully believe it, her gaze fixed on Ethan now, searching for confirmation or denial, for something that would stabilize the situation. But Ethan offered neither, he simply held the pen between his fingers, turning it once, slowly, like time itself had shifted into his control. Richard Halstead did not speak immediately, and that silence from him carried more weight than anything he had said before, because it was no longer strategic, it was necessary. He was recalculating, adjusting, trying to determine whether this was a misunderstanding that could be corrected or a mistake that could not. His eyes moved to the associate in the corner, then back to Ethan, then briefly to the documents on the table, as if the answer might be written somewhere between them. Explain it, he said finally, his voice lower now, controlled but no longer dismissive. The command was not directed at Ethan, but at the situation itself, at the fracture that had just opened in the room. The associate hesitated only for a moment before speaking again. The primary file is tied to ownership level clearance, she said, her voice steadier now that the truth had already crossed the line. It is not just access, it is authority. The system logs do not allow external viewing at that level. The words landed with precision, each one removing another layer of doubt that had protected the room just minutes ago. The younger man's jaw tightened slightly, the realization settling in whether he wanted it to or not. The woman in navy closed her folder completely now, no longer pretending to lead the conversation. Richard exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, but one that carried the weight of a shift he could no longer ignore, and still, even with everything changing, he held on to one last thread of control. If that is true, he said, his eyes locking onto Ethan with a sharper focus than before, then you would not be sitting here quietly letting this play out. It was not a question, it was a test. One final attempt to frame the situation in a way that made sense within his understanding of power, because in his world, authority announced itself. It did not sit silently and observe. Ethan's gaze met his then, steady, unflinching, not aggressive, not defensive, just certain. That depends, he said, his voice calm but carrying something deeper now, something that had not been there before, on whether I came here to make a deal. A pause followed, brief but deliberate, his fingers stilling on the pen, or to see if you deserved one. The sentence did not rise, it did not need emphasis, it landed exactly where it was meant to, and for the first time, the room did not just feel uncertain, it felt exposed. Like every word spoken before, every glance, every assumption had been part of something larger than they realized. The waiter near the wall lowered his tray slightly, no longer pretending this was just another meeting. The associate in the corner did not look down again, her attention fixed entirely on Ethan now, and Richard, for all his control, for all his presence, said nothing, because in that moment, the balance had shifted completely, not in volume, not in movement, but in truth, and everyone in that room felt it, whether they were ready to admit it or not. The words did not echo, they settled, heavy and final, and for a moment no one in the room moved, not because they did not understand what Ethan had said, but because they understood it too well, the kind of understanding that does not invite reaction, it demands recalibration. Richard Halstead's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the table, a small movement, almost invisible, but in a room built on control. Even that shift carried meaning. He leaned forward again, slower this time. More deliberate. His voice when it came was measured, but it no longer carried the same certainty. You are suggesting, he said carefully, choosing each word like it mattered more than before, that this entire negotiation depends on your approval. The phrasing was intentional, an attempt to regain structure, to frame the situation in a way that still placed him in command of it, but the room did not fully return to him, not like it had earlier. The younger man at the end of the table did not jump in, did not reinforce the narrative, he simply watched, waiting. The woman in navy did not open her folder again, her hands resting still, her attention fixed entirely on Ethan now, as if the documents no longer held the authority they once did. Ethan did not answer immediately, and that pause stretched, deliberate, controlled, like he was allowing the weight of the question to settle fully before responding. I am not suggesting anything, he said finally, his voice steady, unhurried. I am observing what you have already shown me. The distinction landed with precision, and it cut deeper than any direct challenge could have, because it shifted the focus away from him and back onto them, onto their words, their actions, their assumptions. The room did not react outwardly, but the tension sharpened, more focused now, less scattered, the kind of tension that forms when people begin to realize they have already revealed more than they intended. The junior associate in the corner took a small step forward, not enough to interrupt, but enough to position herself closer to the table, closer to the truth that was unfolding, her tablet still in her hands, but now held differently, not as a tool for observation, but as confirmation. The waiter had stopped pretending entirely, his presence now still, attentive, as if he understood that whatever happened next would matter far beyond this room. Richard exhaled again, slower this time, and when he spoke, the edge returned. Not as strong as before, but present. Then let us be clear, he said, his gaze locking onto Ethan. We have spent months structuring this agreement, aligning capital, coordinating legal teams, and preparing for execution. This is not a situation where one individual simply decides to walk away based on personal impressions. The statement was firm, but it carried something new beneath it, a subtle need for validation, for reassurance that the structure they had built still held power, that it could not be undone so easily. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, not larger, not louder, just more defined, like the moment itself had reached a point where stillness was no longer enough. He placed the pen down gently on the table, the soft contact drawing every eye again, and when he spoke, his voice carried a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. You are right, he said. And for a split second, the room leaned into that agreement, hoping it meant restoration, hoping it meant the return of the dynamic they understood. But Ethan continued, his tone unchanged. It is not one individual. A brief pause, just enough to separate what came next. It is the one who owns the decision. The sentence did not rise, it did not need emphasis, it landed with quiet certainty, and this time, the silence that followed was not confusion, it was realization. Slow but undeniable. The younger man's posture stiffened, the woman in navy drew a quiet breath, the associate's grip tightened slightly around her tablet, and Richard, for the first time since the meeting began, did not respond immediately, because the balance had shifted beyond negotiation, beyond structure, into something far more simple and far more dangerous, control, and in that moment, it no longer belonged to him. The room did not breathe the same way anymore. The silence that followed his words was not empty, it was full, thick with realization that moved slowly through each person like something they could not stop once it began, and for a moment no one tried to interrupt it, not even Richard, because even he understood that speaking too quickly now would expose more than it would protect. Ethan remained still, but inside that stillness something shifted, not outwardly, not in posture or expression, but deeper, quieter, like a memory brushing against the present. And for the first time since he walked into the room, his gaze lowered just slightly, not in submission, but in reflection. The table in front of him faded for a second, replaced by something older, something familiar, a different room, smaller, less polished, a conference space years ago where he had sat at the edge instead of the center, dressed just as carefully, prepared just as thoroughly, and still been asked if he was in the right place, still been told to wait until someone senior arrived, someone who looked the part. The words had been softer then, wrapped in corporate politeness, but the meaning had been the same, and before that, another moment, standing in a lobby with a folder in his hand, security asking him who he was there to see, not because he lacked credentials, but because he did not match expectation, because he did not fit the image that room had already decided was allowed to belong. Those moments did not carry anger anymore. Not the kind that needed to be expressed. They had settled into something else over time, something sharper, something controlled, something that did not react. It calculated, it remembered, and it waited. Ethan's fingers rested lightly against the table again, grounding him back into the present, back into the room where history was not repeating itself, it was being measured, weighed against what stood in front of him now. The Halstead family, their confidence, their assumptions, their certainty that they could define who belonged and who did not. The difference this time was not what they said, it was what he could do about it. Across the table Richard finally shifted again, not as the dominant force in the room, but as someone trying to understand the ground beneath him. If what you are implying is accurate, he said slowly, his voice controlled but no longer dismissive, then there has been a miscommunication in how this meeting was arranged. The phrasing was careful, strategic, an attempt to redirect responsibility away from behavior and into process, to suggest that whatever had happened here was procedural, not personal. The woman in navy nodded slightly, catching on to the shift. Yes, clearly there was a breakdown in coordination, she added, her tone softer now, more measured. We were expecting direct representation from the lead investor. The implication hung there, subtle but clear. If Ethan was that representation, then the issue was not what had been said, but how he had been introduced. A reframing, a quiet attempt to repair the damage without acknowledging it directly. The younger man leaned forward again, but this time his voice carried caution instead of confidence. If you are in fact connected to the ownership level of this deal, he said, choosing his words carefully, then we should clarify roles before moving forward. Clarify roles, the phrase echoed in the room. A polite way of asking a question they were no longer comfortable asking directly. Who are you? Ethan did not respond immediately. He let the room sit in that question, let them feel the weight of it, the same weight he had felt in rooms long before this one. But now the difference was clear. Now he was not the one being evaluated, they were, and for the first time, that realization settled into every corner of the space. The associate in the corner did not look at her tablet anymore. She did not need to. The answer was already present. The waiter stood completely still, aware that whatever happened next would define everything that followed, and Ethan, still calm, still measured, lifted his gaze again, not rushed, not dramatic, just certain, because the moment had arrived, not as an explosion, but as a quiet turning point, where the past met the present, and the outcome was no longer shaped by assumption, but by truth. The room did not rush to fill the silence, because now silence had become something else entirely, not a gap in conversation, but a space where decisions were being made without words. Ethan let his gaze move slowly across the table, not searching, not questioning, just observing, the same way he had from the moment he walked in, but now the weight behind that observation had changed. It was no longer quiet patience. It was control measured in restraint. Richard shifted again, this time leaning back slightly, as if creating distance might restore perspective, but the distance did nothing, because the center of the room had already moved, and it was no longer him. If there has been a misunderstanding, Richard said, his tone carefully neutral, almost diplomatic, then we should correct it before proceeding any further. The phrasing was intentional, not an apology, not an acknowledgement, just a redirection, a way to step away from what had been said without admitting it had mattered. The woman in navy nodded once, quick, subtle, aligning with the shift. Agreed, she added, her voice softer now, more controlled. We are here to finalize terms, not to revisit introductions. But even as she spoke, her eyes did not leave Ethan, because she understood now that introductions were exactly what had been missed, and that omission had consequences they could not simply smooth over. The younger man leaned forward again, but slower this time, his earlier certainty replaced by careful calculation. So let us be clear, he said, his voice measured, if you are in fact representing the ownership side of this deal, then we need to verify that before any further discussion. Verify. the word landed differently. It was no longer dismissive, it was cautious, almost defensive. The need for confirmation now coming from uncertainty instead of authority. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his fingers moved once, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket, not rushed, not dramatic, just deliberate, and for a second, every eye followed that motion, the room tightening again, not with resistance, but anticipation. He pulled out his phone, placed it face down on the table, and tapped it once, a small, controlled action that carried more weight than any raised voice could have. The sound of that tap echoed softly against the polished wood, drawing the room into a moment they could not step away from. Verification is already in progress, Ethan said, his voice calm, steady, leaving no space for interpretation. The associate in the corner looked down at her tablet again, her screen lighting up with new activity, her eyes widening slightly as lines of data updated in real time, access logs shifting, permissions expanding, confirmations layering one over another. She did not speak, but her reaction was enough. The woman in navy noticed it immediately, her posture tightening, her attention shifting from Ethan to the associate and back again. Richard did not move, but his focus sharpened, locked onto Ethan with a level of intensity that had not been there before. What exactly have you done? He asked, not accusing, not aggressive, but controlled, careful. Ethan did not answer directly, instead he turned his phone over slowly, the screen lighting up, a name visible for just a second before he slid it slightly forward across the table, not enough for everyone to read. Just enough for the person across from him to see. Richard's eyes dropped to it, and for the first time since the meeting began, something broke through his composure, not panic, not fear, but recognition, immediate and undeniable, the kind that does not need explanation. The younger man noticed the shift instantly, his gaze snapping to Richard, searching for confirmation. The woman in navy straightened slightly, her breath catching just enough to be heard in the silence. The associate in the corner took a small step closer, no longer hesitant, because whatever was happening now was no longer uncertain, it was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. Ethan leaned back just slightly, not in dominance, not in display, but in completion of a step that had been inevitable from the moment he entered the room, and when he spoke again, his voice did not rise, it did not need to. It carried the kind of certainty that ended questions before they were asked. Now we can move forward, he said, and for the first time, no one in the room questioned whether he had the authority to say it. No one reached for the documents anymore, no one adjusted their glass or shifted in their chair, because the room had already crossed into something else, something where movement felt unnecessary, even risky. Richard Halstead's eyes remained fixed on the phone in front of him for a second longer than he intended, then he leaned back slowly, not retreating, but recalibrating, his fingers pressing together lightly as if rebuilding control from a position that had already slipped. Ethan Cole, he said finally, the name no longer casual, no longer dismissive, it carried weight now, recognition layered with consequence. It would have been helpful to establish that earlier. The statement was careful, almost neutral, but beneath it sat something unspoken, an attempt to redirect the narrative, to suggest that the imbalance in the room had come from timing, not from behavior. The woman in navy followed immediately, her voice smoother now, controlled in a different way. Yes, clarity at the beginning would have avoided unnecessary tension. Unnecessary. The word hung in the air like a quiet rewrite of everything that had just happened. The younger man nodded once, quick, eager to align with the shift. Exactly, we could have approached this very differently. But even as he said it, his voice lacked conviction, because the truth in the room was not about timing, it was about assumption. And everyone felt it whether they acknowledged it or not. Ethan did not interrupt them, did not correct them. He let the words settle, let the attempt to reshape the moment unfold without resistance, because he understood something they did not, that what had already been revealed could not be undone by reframing it. He rested his hands lightly on the table again, calm, composed, and when he spoke, his voice did not carry frustration, it carried precision. You approached it exactly how you intended to, he said, and the sentence landed without force but with impact, the kind that does not need volume to shift a room. The younger man's expression tightened slightly, the woman in navy paused, her hand still resting on the closed folder. Richard's gaze sharpened again, but this time there was no immediate response, because there was nothing simple to say in return. Ethan continued, not raising his voice, not changing his tone. You did not misplace me. he added, "You placed me exactly where your assumption said I belonged." The silence that followed was different now, not uncertain, not confused, but exposed. The associate in the corner did not look away, her eyes fixed on Ethan with a clarity that had replaced hesitation entirely. The waiter near the wall remained still, aware that whatever happened next would not be about service or formality, it would be about consequence. Richard exhaled slowly, a measured breath, and for a moment it seemed like he might push back, might attempt to regain control through authority, but he did not. Instead he shifted his focus to the documents in front of him, then back to Ethan. "We are here to complete a transaction," he said, his tone firm but no longer dominant. $700 million does not move based on perception. The statement was meant to anchor the conversation, to bring it back to numbers, structure, something objective, something they could still control. Ethan nodded once, a small acknowledgement. "You are right," he said, and again the room leaned into that agreement for just a second, hoping it meant stability. But Ethan did not stop there. "It moves based on decision," he added, his voice steady, "and decision is not separate from perception, it is built on it." The words settled into the room like a final piece clicking into place. The younger man looked down briefly. The woman in navy did not reach for her folder again. Richard held his position but did not interrupt, because the truth had shifted from abstract to immediate, and they could all feel it. Ethan leaned forward just slightly now, not aggressively, not dramatically, but with purpose, his hands resting near the documents they had once kept just out of his reach, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet finality that left no space for interpretation. "So before we move forward," he said, "we need to address something far more important than the numbers." And for the first time since the meeting began, no one in the room tried to redirect the conversation, because they all understood, whatever came next would define whether there was a deal at all. The room did not resist what was coming next, it braced for it, every person at the table aware that the conversation had moved beyond negotiation and into something far more precise, accountability. Ethan's gaze remained steady, not scanning, not searching, just fixed within the space like he had already measured everything that mattered. "You said this deal is about structure," he continued, his voice even, controlled. "Alignment, capital, timing." He paused just briefly, letting their own language settle back into the room. "But none of that matters if the foundation is flawed." The words did not rise, they settled, and the silence that followed was not defensive, it was receptive. Richard did not interrupt this time, the woman in navy did not attempt to redirect, the younger man did not lean forward to challenge, because each of them understood that the foundation he was referring to was not financial. It was behavioral. Ethan's hand moved slightly across the table, not toward the documents, not toward the pen, but simply resting in a position that felt final, grounded. "You evaluated me before you heard me," he said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact that no one could deny. "You decided where I belonged before you knew why I was here." The associate in the corner lowered her eyes briefly, not in shame, but in recognition, because she had watched it happen in real time. The way the room had shaped its own narrative without evidence. The waiter remained still, his presence now part of the moment rather than outside of it. Richard exhaled slowly, his posture holding, but his silence deeper now, not strategic, not measured, but necessary, because responding would mean acknowledging something he had not prepared to face. The woman in navy finally spoke, her voice quieter, less certain than before. "We made an assumption," she said, the words careful, controlled. "But that does not define the outcome of the deal." It was an attempt, not to deny, but to contain, to separate behavior from consequence, to suggest that what had happened could be isolated, managed. Ethan nodded once, a small acknowledgement. "You are right," he said, and again the room leaned into that agreement, hoping it would lead back to stability. But Ethan continued, his tone unchanged. "It does not define the outcome." He paused, just enough to shift the weight of what came next. "It reveals it." The words landed with quiet finality. The younger man looked down this time, not out of deference, but because the clarity of the statement left no room for interpretation. The woman in navy did not respond, her hands still, her attention fixed. Richard's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest sign that the pressure had reached something internal, something harder to control. Ethan leaned forward just slightly, not aggressively, but with intention, his voice still calm, still measured, but carrying a certainty that had not been there before. "Because if this is how you handle presence," he said, how you evaluate people before you understand them, a brief pause, then I already know how you will handle pressure, disagreement, risk. The list was not long, but it was enough to connect behavior to consequence, enough to make the decision that followed feel inevitable rather than reactive. The associate in the corner lifted her head again, her attention fully locked on Ethan. The waiter did not move, the room itself felt still, as if even the city outside had paused for a second, and Ethan, without raising his voice, without changing his expression, delivered the conclusion that had been building since the moment he walked through the door, and that is not a structure I invest in. The sentence did not echo, it did not need to, it settled into the room like something permanent, something that could not be negotiated away, and for the first time, no one at the table tried to respond immediately, because they all understood, the decision had already been made, and it was not in their hands anymore. No one spoke when the words settled, not because they did not want to, but because they understood that anything said now would not change what had already been decided. The room held its shape but lost its certainty, the kind of shift that does not break things apart but makes them impossible to put back the way they were. Richard Halstead finally moved, not abruptly, not with force, but with the quiet urgency of someone who realized that silence was no longer a strategy. Let us not move too quickly, he said, his voice measured, controlled, but carrying something new beneath it, not authority, not confidence, but negotiation, the kind that comes when leverage is no longer guaranteed. We are discussing a $700 million opportunity, he continued, his hands resting on the table as if anchoring the moment, one that benefits both sides significantly. The phrasing was careful, balanced, an attempt to bring the conversation back to numbers, to scale, to something objective that could outweigh what had just happened. The woman in navy followed immediately, her tone aligned, softer, more deliberate. There is too much at stake to let a misinterpretation define the outcome, she said. The word misinterpretation placed with precision, another attempt to reframe, to reduce what had occurred into something smaller, something manageable. The younger man nodded quickly, leaning forward just slightly. Exactly, we can reset this, he added, his voice more cautious now. Clarify expectations, align communication, and proceed as intended. The rhythm of corporate recovery filled the space, structured, familiar, designed to rebuild control. But it did not land the same way it would have earlier, because the foundation they were trying to stand on had already shifted. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, his posture steady, not dismissive, not reactive, just present in a way that made their words feel lighter than they intended. He let them finish, let the room attempt to rebuild itself, and when the silence returned, he did not rush to fill it, he allowed it to settle again, heavier this time, because now it carried their effort to recover as well as the truth that had already been established. Then he reached for his phone, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the same deliberate control he had shown from the beginning. He turned the screen toward himself for a brief second, his eyes scanning it, confirming something that had already been decided before he even walked into the room. Then he placed it back down, this time closer to him, not offering it, not sharing it, just positioning it as part of the decision he was about to finalize. You are right, he said, his voice calm, steady, and for a brief moment, the room leaned into those words again, hoping, searching for any sign that the outcome might still be within reach. But Ethan continued, his tone unchanged. There is too much at stake. He paused, not for effect, but because the moment required it, which is exactly why I do not move forward with uncertainty. The sentence landed clean, without resistance, without room for reinterpretation. The younger man's posture stiffened, the woman in navy held her breath just slightly. Richard's gaze did not shift, but something behind it tightened, something internal, something that understood what was coming next even before it was said. Ethan leaned forward just enough to close the distance between himself and the documents that had once been kept just out of his reach, his hand resting lightly beside them, not touching, not claiming, just present. And when he spoke again, his voice carried the kind of finality that did not need to be raised to be heard. This deal, he said, does not proceed. The words did not echo, they did not need to, they settled into the room like something permanent, something that could not be negotiated back into existence. The associate in the corner lowered her tablet slowly, her expression no longer uncertain, just aware. The waiter remained still, understanding without context that something significant had just ended. The woman in navy did not speak, the younger man did not move, and Richard Halstead, for The first time since the meeting began, had no immediate response, because the outcome they had assumed was theirs had just been removed with a single sentence, and there was nothing left in the room that could bring it back. No one reached for anything after that, not the contracts, not their phones, not even their glasses, because the finality of what had just been said did not leave room for reaction, it left space for realization, the kind that settles slowly but permanently. Richard Halstead remained seated, his posture intact but no longer commanding, his presence still strong but no longer decisive. The center of the room had shifted and it was not returning, not this time. The woman in navy sat still, her earlier precision now quiet, her attention fixed on the documents that no longer held meaning. The younger man leaned back, his hands no longer moving, his expression caught. Somewhere between disbelief and understanding, the associate in the corner lowered her tablet completely, no longer needing it, because everything that mattered had already been revealed without it. The waiter finally stepped back, instinctively creating distance from a moment that felt larger than the room itself. Ethan Cole remained exactly where he was, not rushing to stand, not signaling victory, not drawing attention to what he had just done, because for him, this was not a moment of triumph, it was a moment of clarity, and clarity did not require celebration, it required acknowledgement. He looked once more across the table, not at any one person, but at the space itself, the same space that had judged him within seconds of his arrival, the same space that had tried to define him before understanding him, and now, that same space sat in silence, unable to redefine what had already been exposed. Ethan reached for the pen again, the same pen that had once represented agreement, execution, partnership, and he held it for just a second before placing it back down, untouched, exactly where it had been, because the absence of a signature now carried more meaning than any contract ever could. Richard finally spoke, but his voice was quieter, not weak, just altered, shaped by something he had not anticipated when the meeting began. "This is a significant decision," he said. The words careful, deliberate, not a challenge, not a demand, just a statement of fact. Ethan nodded once, acknowledging it without shifting his position. "It is," he replied, his voice calm, steady, unchanged from the moment he walked in, "and it was made the moment I entered this room." The sentence did not accuse, it did not assign blame, it simply placed the timeline exactly where it belonged, at the beginning, not the end. The younger man looked up at that, the realization settling deeper now. The woman in navy closed her folder fully, this time not as a gesture of control, but as acceptance. The associate in the corner did not look away, her expression steady, absorbing every detail of a moment she would not forget. Ethan stood then, not abruptly, not with emphasis, just with quiet intention, his chair moving back softly against the floor, the sound small but definitive, marking the end of something that had never truly begun. He adjusted his jacket once, a simple motion, controlled, composed, then he paused, not because he needed to, but because the moment required one final truth, something that would remain long after he walked out. He looked toward Richard, not with challenge, not with anger, but with clarity, and when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of calm that only comes from certainty. "You did not lose this deal today," he said, a brief pause, just enough to separate what came next. "You revealed why you were never going to keep it." The words settled into the room like a closing statement, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. Ethan turned then, walking toward the door with the same measured pace he had entered with, no rush, no hesitation, just forward, because nothing behind him required his attention anymore. And as the door closed softly behind him, the room remained exactly as it was, unchanged in structure, unchanged in appearance, but entirely different in truth, because for the first time, everyone inside it understood something they had not when the meeting began. Power does not need to announce itself, and justice does not need to raise its voice, it only needs to arrive, be seen, and leave on its own terms.